Welcome. I am glad that you are here with us tonight, either watching our live show or watching the replay. I'm Charmaine Tanner, and I want to welcome you to my weekly show that I do every Thursday on our Facebook page here. And tonight is exciting because we have a special guest with us, Carlyle King, who works at Boise State University, is going to be joining us in a conversation. And there's a variety of topics that we can talk about, and Carlyle is pretty open to answering your questions and explaining different things or talking about some of the interests that he has. So Carlyle has been a disability activist for, I don't know, Carlyle, shall we say your whole life? or
Arguably my whole life, but I was officially diagnosed with autism about 10 years ago, and so that's when it really picked up.
And, you know, I have gotten to know Carlyle here in Boise, but what's so nice is that he also uses his expertise to help train police departments, not only in Idaho, but I know he's done work in Oregon also, and mainly with the focus of helping police officers know how to interact with autistic people. And then also he says there are some times where he will do some additional training with the police department about what to do when there's a missing autistic child, and helping them know, you know, what kinds of actions that they can take that will be helpful. Carlyle is also really great at helping educate others about the organization Autism Speaks. And that might be a topic of conversation that we get into. One of Carlyle's goals is to find a welcoming church where he feels that he belongs. So if that's something that you identify with, you might want to ask us a question about that topic. The other thing I know about Carlyle is I know he's had a passion for riding motorcycles, but I just learned tonight that because of some back injuries, he no longer is riding that big Harley, but instead has a Jeep that is pretty awesome. So I thought it would be kind of interesting for Carlyle to start us with, you know, because to me, when I think of motorcycles or Jeeps on, you know, four-wheel drive roads, it's like fearful. That is not something I would feel comfortable with. So I thought it would be, I'm trying to understand other people's point of view. So Carlyle, can you tell us from your viewpoint, what's it like when you were riding that motorcycle or now driving in your Jeep, and why do you love that so much?
So for me, it's largely a sensory thing. And my Jeep is a ragtop, so I can actually remove all of the windows all around. And so right now you can't see it, but you know, it's got windshield and a canvas top over it, and that's it. And so even in a Jeep, my beard blows around and there's lots of wind inside. I actually like being cold. I drove it like that this morning. It was like 42 degrees. And I was dressed just like this, so short sleeve shirt. A lot of the same stuff applies to the motorcycle. I like the force of the wind in my face, and I like the cold. I also like the way it leans, and you experience that on the Jeep in a different way, because you can actually tip the Jeep pretty far over without rolling it over. But of course that happens at much slower speeds and such than motorcycles, so it is different, but it's nice to just feel, you know, all the combination of positions and wind blowing and all the smells, everything else.
How neat, how neat. Well, we do have some live viewers, so if you can say hi and let us know where you're watching from so we can welcome you. And we encourage you to be involved in the conversation, so you can post questions in the comments or, you know, comment on the conversation that we're talking about. So it's more interactive with us, because that's, I think, always a good thing. So when I talked to Carlyle and asked if he would be a guest with us, one of the things that we had kind of looked at too was in April, with April being a month that sometimes can be actually kind of more stress producing. I don't know if that's how you would describe it, Carlyle, but with the focus on autism, sometimes more the focus on autism awareness versus autism acceptance. And what I think is interesting, Carlyle, is like when I see some of your posts on Facebook and you talk about how this is not really a month that you look forward to. So I think your insights into that would be helpful for us too.
So for autistic adults in general, it can get pretty uncomfortable because we get to see uh, all of the stories about how it's all about kids and it's such a horrible thing. And uh, we often feel that we are forgotten entirely, or if we're not forgotten, then people will talk about how we're not as autistic as their kid. Well, I'm 40 years older than your kid, so there's a bit of an experience and some learning in there. All of these factors play out to make it very stressful. Some of us get into quite a few arguments. Mine have been somewhat different this year because I'm actually having an ongoing conversation with Autism Speaks as they prepare to start doing fundraisers in our area. And it kind of feels like the same argument, but with a different face on it.
So do you want to explain that a little bit more? Like what has changed within that? And so maybe what you can do for people that aren't familiar with some of the practices of Autism Speaks and why there's so many of us that would rather see people support local Autism Society affiliates. So do you want to maybe touch on what some of those differences are?
Sure. So a little bit of history. Autism Speaks was started by Bob Wright and his wife. Bob Wright was at the time the chairman of NBC. And they have had, in her case, I guess, but an autistic grandson. And so that's the reason they started it. And it seems like Bob was really removed from the broader experience of what autism actually is, not knowing much in the way of autistic adults and such. And so the early messaging from Autism Speaks, a lot of this you can still find online if you look on YouTube and such. These videos, which I'm guessing were designed to be heart-wrenching and money-generating, they portray this horrible experience of autism. And the problem, well, some of the problems this causes are that people expect that autism looks a certain way as it is described in those videos. And so they'll look at someone like me and they'll say, well, you can't possibly be autistic, or you're not as autistic as someone who's really suffering. A good way to contrast that with a physical disability, I am physically disabled, and I find this to be a useful analogy quite frequently. My left arm is paralyzed. And when I tell people that, usually the first response is something like, well, at least you weren't left-handed, but I was. So you can't just look and see just how much of a loss that was. But I can walk. And I can do so many other things. And so people will say, well, the person in the wheelchair is worse off. I don't even really like making that comparison because I still lost the function of my arm, and that is a tremendously life-changing thing. And if you doubt that, put one hand behind your back and wash your dishes. See how many of them you break, because it'll happen. And so back to being autistic, I do struggle with a lot of things because of being autistic. And those struggles don't just go away because I push through them or whatever, or because someone has a different idea of what autism is. So that was the initial damage of Autism Speaks. And I think to go along with that, we had this tremendous separation of parents versus autistic self-advocates, which I've had to overcome in the local community. I am the first autistic person to serve on the board of the local Autism Society. And during my first few years there, I spent a lot of time reminding the parent board members that their children were getting older and would eventually also be adults, so they should care what happens to adults. And I was finally able to get some conversation going on about the experiences of autistic adults. We still have a long way to go. It's still quite a bit of struggle for many of us to find a job here or to get other supports. Those of us who are in our 30s and later don't have the same access to mental health care and other supports as other people. I will admit that I am an exception to that because I'm a disabled veteran, so I do get mostly free mental health care, but it is a problem for autistic adults generally. And you know, the division between parents and autistic advocates has, it's almost like there's a competition for resources. Like, my kid struggles more than you do, so my kid deserves all of these supports. Well, part of the problem that we run into, especially with some of these much younger adults, like having recently become adults, because they can't get help getting a job or some of the other supports that would actually help them, they end up taking up resources that could be used for autistic people that need them more, such as group homes in Idaho, which are quite crowded. So yeah, these are some of the problems that I feel like they started earlier on. Now, Bob Wright, he and his wife eventually got out of the picture. I think it was because she got cancer. Somebody that knows better might correct me on that, but I know that she died, and so he stepped aside. But they still use a lot of the same techniques for raising money. And they claim that they are changing, and they have on some occasions acknowledged that some of their earlier stuff maybe was kind of damaging, but they haven't been willing to apologize for it, which would go a long way. In fact, I would really appreciate it if they would more publicly acknowledge that they did some bad things earlier on. But the conversation that we're now having is basically them being unaware. So they've focused exclusively on kids for all of these years, and they're talking about doing stuff for adults. My interactions with them started when they had an informational meeting back in March here in Boise. And in that meeting, there was mention of how we're all in this together as parents. And they had to be corrected on that. And it had to be pointed out to them that there were a number of autistic adults in the room, some of whom had autistic children, some of whom do not. And, you know, I've been talking to them about this for a long time, you know, almost every other day since we had that meeing, and trying to explain to them the benefit of supporting local autistic leaders. So if you help those of us that are in our 20s and 30s to be able to get jobs, and this can certainly be done. I'm the founder of Boise Autistic Adults and Allies, in case anybody on here doesn't know. And we've had some success, and I credit my wife with a lot of this, but in coaching young autistic adults in putting together a resume, talking them through how the job interview goes. And I know at least one case where my wife has helped an autistic job seeker negotiate a higher wage than he would have gotten.
Cool.
So I don't think these things are all of that hard. And as we do this, those that come behind us will need less and less support, and they'll take up less and less resources, which can then be applied to others. But so far, this conversation isn't going very well. They don't seem aware of exactly what it means to connect with and support autistic adults.
Well, and Tiffany says that informational meeting was very interesting, but she says not in a good way.
Yeah, Tiffany was actually the one that pointed out that there were autistic adults in the room. And yeah, it was telling, you know, to me, it really hurt that we were forgotten, we being the autistic adults. As for why you would like to support local charities, I will say that they're not exactly perfect, but they do understand the local community and they understand the local issues. They also know a lot of the local families and the autistic leaders, and so that puts them in a better position to be able to make decisions as to what to do with the funds. And one of my concerns is that with Autism Speaks fundraising in our community, there's going to be less available for the local charities. And Autism Speaks does not necessarily invest in a community the same amount of money that they take out of it. Also, I have looked at the money that has come to Idaho. Early on in our conversations, they said, well, we've spent this much money in Idaho. And I've got a full breakdown. I don't have it right in front of me, but it was roughly about $120,000, over 80% of which went to one company. I don't know everything that company does, but I have researched it enough to know that not all of that money necessarily benefits Idaho. So their $100,000 fundraising goal toward the end of this year seems a bit much, considering what they've put in the community, but that's another conversation, I guess.
Well, and I think the issue of employment is like so critical because, you know, as far as more employers knowing the value and the benefits of hiring autistic people and knowing that reasonable accommodations can and should be made. So what tips do you give autistic job seekers as far as bringing up the conversation and, you know, sharing some accommodations that could be helpful for them at work?
So I'm going to preface this by saying that I have what at least has been an unpopular opinion. I think it's kind of changing a little bit, but I am of the opinion that you should talk about being autistic in the interview. And the reason I say that's because the interview is a social interaction. We tend to have a hard time with social interactions and people don't really know how to read us. So it kind of helps if we give them something to think about other than this is a rude or generally dislikable person. So I have developed a habit of telling people in the interview that I am autistic. This may have cost me some other jobs, but the way I look at it, it makes it easier to have the accommodation conversation. Sometimes you can even have it in the interview. And it also means that if you tell them that you're autistic and they hire you still, then you have an employer that you can work with. I don't want an employer where I have to pretend to be something I'm not. I have had other autistic adults, and I think their opinion deserves to be heard, tell me that disclosing in the interview puts them at high risk of not getting the job. And that they should have that option. I completely agree. You can decide whether you want to do that or not. I do think, though, that the more of us who disclose, the more aware that employers are going to be, because they'll hear about autism in an interview and they're like, oh yeah, we interviewed somebody else who was autistic, and maybe didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe all of those employers that didn't hire me after I told them that I was autistic, and I can't say for sure it's because I did, but maybe they ran into another autistic person in an interview, or maybe they gave it some thought later, and maybe that changed their minds on some things. As far as the accommodations, it does kind of depend on what sort of job you want to do. You and I were talking before we got on this that I was a mechanic in the Navy, and I would actually enjoy that kind of work. The problem that we run into is that kind of an environment can be a bit noisy and chaotic. And I find that the older I get, the less tolerant I am of that. And I've got these sensory issues anyway. In my current job, where I work with computers and I'm very much behind the scenes, I mean, you have to badge in through a door just to get to me, and I don't have to talk to the people around me. I can literally go for weeks without saying a word to anyone at my job. It's lovely. I don't answer the phone. I very rarely use the phone at all. Most of my communication with everybody that I connect with is text. And especially for those of us who have phone anxiety, which is pretty common, or who have difficulty putting our words together, because it takes us a little bit longer to think about it and that sort of thing. I think those are great accommodations to ask for. You just have to keep in mind what the job is. Obviously, you couldn't really request text-only communication as an accommodation in sales,
Right.
Retail sales specifically. But, I would also look at the various sensory issues. This day, I don't see very many office buildings that have the annoying lights that I can hear.
Right.
So maybe that's less of a concern anymore, but consider the lighting, consider distractions. One thing that I asked for at my office is I like to have a wall to my back. I think that kind of goes along with my anxiety. I don't like people coming up from behind me. But that may be an individual thing. But generally things like that. Also, let people know that you might seem a little bit different in communicating. I think this is probably one of the most important ones, is let them know that your body language might be different. You might be a little different about communicating. Just be patient with that, and maybe not make quick assumptions about what a facial expression or body language necessarily means. Ask before you react to it. So that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I too appreciate you talking about having that wall behind you, because as an advocate that pretty much works in K through 12, situations in schools, one of the common accommodations is preferential seating. And I always ask people like, well, what does that mean? Because I know there are students, usually I think we think of preferential seating like being close to the board or close to the teacher, but there are students that would rather sit at the back of the room. That would be their preference, so they don't have to worry about what's going on behind them. So I think being specific and really understanding why the person is asking for that accommodation, then that helps, gain that understanding, and it increases kind of that understanding,
Mhm.
So one of the other things that I know that we were talking a little bit before the show about was people that prefer people first language and people that prefer identity first language. I know in a lot of different communities and Facebook groups and such that that's a conversation. And I had mentioned to Carlyle that probably for the past 30 years, I've really been using people first language. And I'm finally getting with the program here and understanding that there are a number of people that would prefer the identity first language. And so that is something that is like a change for me, a different, this has been pretty much a habit, a way of communicating. But I also understand that I want to be respectful for what people are asking for. So Carlyle, do you want to maybe speak a little bit about identity first language and people first language?
Oh yeah. And I will say that there are a range of opinions on this, even among autistic people and more broadly disabled people. As you can already hear, I have a preference for identity first language. I am generally not that picky. I won't fight with somebody over it unless they tell me that what I'm saying is wrong. I'm generally okay with what people will call me. I do think that it's a very big respect issue. So, for example, if I decide that I'm going to call you a girl, that might be acceptable from some of your friends, but I don't think you really want to hear that from me. It doesn't seem all that respectful, right? And technically, you're true. It's true. You're female, but if you tell me that you don't like to be called that and you would prefer to be called a woman, I should respect that. And the same thing applies here. So if I want to be called an autistic person as opposed to a person with autism, or a disabled person as opposed to a person with a disability, then that should be respected. On larger views of this, we can see that the blind and deaf communities prefer identity first, and you were talking about how you've noticed that the deaf community is quite proud of that. The adult autistic community is getting there. I don't hear much these days from autistic adults who would prefer to be called person with autism. As you pointed out, there are some communities that still prefer the person first. So this is not even something that is consistent across disability, and somebody could feel like, well, shoot, I can get into all kinds of trouble with this, and I probably just shouldn't say anything. The way I see it, there is tremendous amount of, awesomeness in humility and the willingness to apologize. Because I really think this whole language thing is more of a relational issue. And I know for me personally, if I'm interacting with somebody, I just want to know that they respect me and they care about me as a person. And so if they call me a person with autism and I say, hey, I really like to be called an autistic person, and they are willing to say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you. That really says a lot about how they care about you as a person. because they care enough to say, okay, I didn't want to hurt your feelings. I think that's the thing that people really should keep in mind. Don't be afraid to interact with people, and just be willing to be humble about it and show caring for the person. Unless you don't care about the person, in which case, why are you talking to them?
Well, and I think the other thing is too is, you know, where a parent's position is and the role that parents play. And I think it's different when our kids are very young, but you know, looking at how we can model advocacy so our children become, you know, effective self-advocates. But then also, you know, when a parent needs to take more of the position of helping maybe their autistic child amplify their voice versus being their voice. So I don't know if you can speak about that and the role that allies can play.
So I have to admit that my perspective on this might be a little bit different than other people's, because I was not physically disabled as a child. My physical disability happened from an accident when I was 23. And I was not diagnosed as autistic when I was a child, although that would have helped tremendously. What I can speak to as a child, I was called retarded and all kind of other things you really don't want to hear said about your child, often in front of my parents. And my parents even would tell the story about me being born. I was born with the umbilical cord wrapped around my neck and I wasn't breathing and all that stuff. And the doctor said that if I survived, I would be retarded. And so my parents would tell the story, and that just added to the problem. So I think the first thing is that parents need to be extremely careful about how other people are allowed to talk about their child and how they tell their child's story. One thing that I really appreciate, especially as autistic adults have stood up and been telling their stories in this community, is that parents have respected their own children's privacy much more. You know, to the point to where we have parents locally that get angry because other people are posting their kids' meltdowns online and such. And, you know, they claim it's about educating people. But you got to think about the damage this does to your kid. Once you put it out online, I mean, you hear this said about pornography a lot. Once you put naked pictures of yourself out there, they never come back. And in this case, you're making that choice for your kid.
Right.
So yeah, in these cases, you may think you're speaking for your kid or on behalf of your kid or whatever. No, that should always be your kid's choice. So yeah, first thing is respect your kid's privacy and insist that everybody else respect your kid. After that, let your kid guide you. I mean, when my daughter was 2, of course, she was speaking pretty well at the time, but you know, she still wouldn't necessarily be able to stand in front of a group of adults and, you know, speak up. And so we can't expect that from a child who can barely speak at all. But as they get older, then they will be able to give you cues, because you will learn to communicate with your child. And then let them guide you on how you can best support them. I guess that's the best answer I can give.
Yeah, and Kayla's with us, and she says that Carlyle has been such a blessing to my family. As a parent, I have followed Carlyle's lead to be sure that I'm not out of line as someone who is simply a parent, not autistic.
Oh, thanks for that. I appreciate that.
And I know that Kayla represents a number of families, I'm sure not just in the Treasure Valley area, but others that have been able to hear Carlyle speak and learn from him. So I think the information that you share with us is so helpful. And I'm hoping that our viewers, either watching us live or on the replay, might be thinking of other people that can use this information and reach out to them also, because the more that we can, increase the amount of people that hear from autistic adults, I think we all benefit from that so much. So it's very important. And I know, Carlyle, that you have seen some changes that have happened. And I wonder, because we do have quite a few parents that are viewers, if, would you have some tips for, when you were in school, what would be some changes that you would have liked to have seen? Because chances are those are changes that we still need to make in our education system.
I have actually said many times that I would have been better off if my teachers would have helped me with social skills and left me alone with the academics. Because I could just read the book. I really never paid attention much in class. Definitely help with the bullying. And when a kid comes to you and tells you that they're being bullied, take it seriously, investigate it, find out what's going on, see if you can fix it, especially if it's a kid who doesn't seem to fit in with everybody else. I was the perpetual bad guy. I actually found it interesting. I found a blog post by another autistic adult about the experience of being the perpetual bad guy as an autistic person. And, maybe
Oops, we lost Carlyle there. Let me bring him back up to the broadcast. And here he is.
So I would even say that some of my teachers could even be counted among my bullies.
I've seen that. And that's like really interesting, because I think when we think about bullying, we kind of go to another student, versus there are adults, and like you said, teachers have been known to bully students. And so parents need to pay particular attention to that, because that is like, how can we allow people like that to be around our children? So that's something that, is just, we read so many stories about, the effects of restraint and seclusion on students, and just kind of the psychological bullying that can go on from adults and from other students that, has like this lifelong impact on people. And like you said, it comes back to the basic understanding that we are all humans that deserve to be respected, and that that is part of the basic foundation of how we should be treating each other.
Yep. And related to that, I think one thing I would like to talk about is what we call masking or camouflage, which is the collection of skills that we as autistic people develop to hide the traits of being autistic. Putting this stuff into effect is a lot of work. It's very draining. And a lot of us, myself included, have been trying to undo these bad habits. So yes, I will be getting progressively more weird. But we really need to adjust the whole world such that the traits of autism are not necessarily viewed as a bad thing. If you look at a lot of the therapies, especially those that claim to cure us, these therapies actually coerce autistic children into appearing non-autistic, which means forcing the use of this camouflage. And I want to tell you the real cost of this, because it's not the energy that it takes to do it. The real cost of the camouflage is that the outward person that people see is not the actual person. So even if people like this newly changed, newly cured autistic person, they don't actually like the person.
Hmm.
And that's tremendously hurtful, because we all want to be loved as we are. So definitely keep that in mind.
Right. And I think also when I look at, your conversations that you've had about looking for a church and trying to find a church where you truly feel welcome and that you belong. And, sometimes it would seem like, oh, well, for sure, church communities would be open and, rejoicing and accepting people. But that's not always the case for autistic adults.
That's true. Any church will let me sit and listen to a sermon. But I actually want to have a community. And, I've had so many people over the course of my church experience, including the pastor that married my wife and me. He told us that he didn't like having me around. I've had other people try to come and explain to me why nobody likes me. This amounts to the same kind of effect that I was talking about before with trying to coerce kids to pretend to not be autistic. Why are we perpetuating this message to these kids? They are not likable as they are. Why can't we teach society at large to get to know people that are different and appreciate the differences? Yeah, I'm weird. I actually like being weird. And I would like to be able to just have fun with it. I don't understand why that can't be the way things are.
Right. And Jen has joined us, and she was commenting when we were talking about the bully situation, and she said that therapists can be bullies too.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I have known one that I've had tremendous problems with that fits into multiple boxes, ordained minister, therapist, the list goes on. So yeah, I mean, anybody in any sort of authority position can totally be a bully.
Right, right. And Tiffany was saying, I remember when my boys were little, I was told by professionals that the goal for them was to be indistinguishable from their peers. Ugh.
Yeah, that's pretty much the mission of ABA, Applied Behavior Analysis. And basically that's the exact same thing that I'm talking about with the camouflaging is you're coercing these kids to be just like all of those around them. And why would you even want that?
Right.
Why do we all have to be the same?
Well, and I know, and I've heard teachers say that where, I remember distinctly a little boy, and the teacher was saying, the special ed teacher was saying, once he can look and act like other first graders, he can be in a first grade classroom, but not until then. And it was like, what? I mean, it's like, wow. So yeah, I can see why, there's both kind of implicit and really obvious kind of pressure for autistic people to develop those masking skills because of their experiences that they've had themselves.
And what really stinks is that sort of attitude also further impairs the social development of someone who, by definition, is impaired in their social development. I'm not really sure that I would actually label it so, but if you want us to develop somewhat like other people, we have to be around other people. And that's one of the biggest reasons why I've pushed quite a bit for more and more social opportunities for autistic adults, and not just with other autistic adults. Speaking of anybody who's on here or listening to the replay that hasn't heard about Boise Autistic Adults and Allies, I would invite you to join that, especially if you are a younger adult. I find it pretty easy because I've been able to connect with a lot of parents to bring in non-autistic older adults. Somebody's going to slap me for that, but I'm in my 40s, and that's pretty much where I'm going to find those who have autistic kids. And so if I create some sort of a social event, those are the non-autistic people that are going to show up to be friends with the other autistic adults. And the thing is, a lot of us are in our 20s and early 30s and would like to hang out with other people that are in the same general stage of life, maybe not necessarily have kids or have younger kids. So if you know people that would fit into that category and would like to come and connect with us and appreciate the weirdness, it's really beneficial to our overall well-being, and it gives us more social experience. So there's my plug for that.
Yes. And there is I believe it's a closed Facebook group for Boise Autistic Adults and Allies. So that might also be a place, if you are a kindred spirit, for you to come and join the conversations that are there.
Yeah, I am the founder of that group. And we've somehow made it to about 500 members without even advertising, which I think I might need to change at some point. I was a little cautious at first. I didn't want to be overwhelmed with negative attitudes about autism, but I think we reached a good place with that. So
good. Yeah, so that's really, I think that's a necessary thing for communities. And Amanda is with us, and Amanda Murphy says, "Thank you, Carlyle. Your advocacy has helped our family more than you'll ever know. I wish every family was as lucky as we've been to hear this advice."
Thanks for that.
So see, you have a fan club out there. You probably knew that, though.
My wife told me that. I'll admit, I still struggle with the depression, and I get feeling down on myself. So this kind of stuff helps.
Yeah, so I know it's kind of like nice affirmations that you can return to and remember the impact that you're having on so many families, and learning from things that you would have liked to have seen change when you're younger. And so families can start, pursuing that and changing that now. And then also just having that dialogue in that community with other autistic adults. So, you form kind of that, that friendship, and then it can develop in other areas too, besides having autism as your one common aspect of your life,
Mm-hmm.
So, yes. And Jen says, "I feel like there is a gap of help for teen," and she puts in quotes, "low functioning autistics, nonverbal specifically. What do you think?"
I would sort of agree. And the reason I say sort of is because I think a lot of the problem is a lack of understanding. I have seen the writings of a number of non-speaking autistic adults, and among autistic adults, on Facebook and such, we tend to refer to other autistic adults by specific challenges in cases where it matters. In fact, I'm gonna give you the high and low functioning talk that I give to the cops. This is another case where my physical disability is highly useful. So they tell them to imagine a scenario where I'm out riding a motorcycle and they pull me over. And so we end up handling the traffic stop, and the cop reaches a point where he thinks that I need to put my hands behind my back or behind my head or whatever, and I tell them I can't. And then my question to them is, do you believe me? Because I just got off a motorcycle. And the problem with high and low functioning is that when we think of someone as high functioning, we think this person can do complex things, so they can also do all simple things. The problem with that is, in the scenario that I give the cops, I just got off a motorcycle, which is generally recognized to be a complex activity. I mean, there's a lot of adults that can't do that. Fully abled adults can't ride a motorcycle. Here I am, partially paralyzed, and I ride one. In fact, I've ridden close to 100,000 miles in this condition, so I've done it quite a bit. But I can't clap my hands, which the average 3-year-old can totally do. That's a simple activity. So then the question, of course, to the cops is, do you believe me? And I usually don't get much of any answers to that, because that becomes a really hard question, because they know it's a trick question in the moment, but in the traffic stop, they're likely to make the wrong decision and think that I'm disobeying them on purpose. So the same thing applies to so-called high and low functioning autistic adults. In fact, if you've never heard of it, I highly recommend that you watch the movie Wretches and Jabberers.
Right.
The two men that made that movie, I attended a lecture given by them, and I say lecture kind of loosely because neither of them speaks. One of them is my age, the other one is about 20 years older. They can get out a few words, but for the most part, they use these little talking devices. These guys made a movie about the experience of being autistic, and their story is kind of heartbreaking because both of them spent a large portion of their lives in institutions where people thought they couldn't do anything. So we really need to do away with the high and low functioning thing, and I do appreciate that you put it in quotes, because with high functioning people, supposedly, you miss our struggles, you miss the things that we can't do, but with the opposite end, you miss what they can do. And I can show you not only that movie, but the writings of other non-speaking adult autistic individuals. And you'll find that this is very high quality writing. Some of these people even have college degrees, graduate degrees even. So you have to be careful about how you're looking at that. So I think the problem isn't so much that there's a gap. I think the problem is that there's a lack of understanding. Because I can certainly turn that back around, and I can say that there's a gap in support for autistic adults, especially those of us diagnosed later in life, or those of us who have aged out of other services. We still need more access to mental health care and job finding services than the average person. And I don't want to make it about us versus them and who gets limited resources. I think we can all work this out if we increase autism understanding and the acceptance of autistic traits, and for that matter, the acceptance of alternative communication methods. I think a big part of the problem for those who are viewed as low functioning is that the methods they use to communicate are not accepted, not understood, and not allowed, which was the case with these gentlemen who made that movie.
Oh, exactly. And I've been able to hear them speak at a conference a couple times. And when I was a teacher, I had a student that used facilitated communication to type, his responses and his thoughts. And yeah, it's so interesting because we often make judgments if somebody doesn't have that verbal communication, that they also have, intellectual disabilities, or they don't have something to say. And so, yeah, it's up to us to stop those judgments and to really learn from others. If people want to know more about the Wretches and Jabbers movie that Carlyle mentioned, I can put a link in our in our post after the video. The other thing I was going to bring up was somebody had said that they just started watching. We believe my husband has autism. How do we get him assessed?
Now, this is a question I'm very much familiar with because that's what happened to me. I was 35 when I was diagnosed. So the first thing you're going to want to do is find someone who's able to do the diagnosis that will deal with adults. If you're able to get in touch with Charmaine, I can reach out to some friends who are in the profession and get recommendations as to who locally will do that now. It's been a while for me, and the guy who diagnosed me has moved away. So I can help you find a professional that would be willing to do the assessment. After that, if you want to know what the assessment is like, it's an interview and a few different tests. The whole process took me about 12 hours physically in the professional's office. And then you wait a few days and they will send you a written report as to the opinion. So that's what the process looks like. So yeah, if you can ping Charmaine at some point afterwards, give me a few days and I'll see who I can round up that'd be willing to do the assessment for an adult.
And actually, she says that they live in northern Colorado, so I can.
What town?
Yeah, so if you let us know, I don't know if you guys are up by Greeley or Fort Collins, so if you let us know. Do you have connections in Colorado, Carlyle?
I do. I don't know that it's that far north, but
Okay.
I can definitely ask around and see if anybody can point me in that direction. I know a number of autistic adults in Colorado. I also have, my wife has family in Colorado, so I can still possibly be of assistance there.
Yeah, and I would be happy to help. Before moving to Boise about 5 years ago, I lived for about 40 years in Colorado. So I would be happy to also look and see if we can get connections. But yeah, so if you can let us know, Karen, exactly. Oh, okay. So she said, thank you. They live in Wellington, Colorado. So yeah, I can scope out some resources, and between Carlyle and myself, we can probably at least get you started. And, so yeah, she says that that's about 10 miles north of Fort Collins. Yeah. So
I think the biggest barrier to that is that so many professionals aren't willing to work with adults.
I bet. And, going back and talking about judgments that people make about people that don't have verbal communication, Jen said that she agrees with Carlyle. My boys are amazing regardless of speech. I wasn't sure how to express myself quickly. My apologies. And I don't think you need to apologize at all, Jen. I think you brought up a very good point, and it was really helpful for the conversation. So thank you very much.
Definitely a worthwhile question. So no worries.
Yeah. And Tiffany knows her boys, and she says, your boys are amazing.
Well, that's all I need to know then. Tiffany, well.
I know. So Tiffany's our gold standard. If she likes it, we know it's going to be okay, right? And I know Tiffany has been interested in, I was talking to Carlyle, we are trying to bring post-secondary opportunities for autistic students, but also other students with intellectual disabilities or developmental disabilities, bring them the opportunity to go to college, either community college or university in Idaho. And if that is something that listeners are interested in, please let us know. I know Karen in Colorado, they have 3 different universities or colleges now that are part of that Think College program. One at University of Northern Colorado in Greeley. There's one in Denver, and then the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs. Unfortunately, in Idaho, the opportunities are pretty much next to nothing. And so we are trying to create change for that. So if there are people that are interested in that, I'm on a statewide task force, and I would love for others to join with us. We are looking at, doing some policy changes and possibly pursuing legislation to provide funding for adults to attend college and have that opportunity like so many other people, if that's their choice. So that's something else. There's like so many other like social justice projects that there's more projects and things that we want to change than sometimes we have volunteers to help. So if that's a passion that you have, please let me know and we can be in touch.
I wonder how much interest there would be in hearing from like maybe a small panel of autistic people who have finished college. Me being one of them, but it's been a while. And I can find some current students even, because I regularly have picnics at BSU and I like to bring together some students. And speaking of which, I have been somewhat fortunate. I've been able to connect with a sorority there, and some of those ladies have actually come to our picnics, and so that provides an additional social opportunity to interact with some non-autistic people. So that's been kind of fun too.
Oh, I bet. And now that the weather's nice, I want to come to one of those picnics. I got to make that on my Friday schedule.
Well, I usually bounce them around to different days of the week.
Oh, do you? Okay. I guess I've seen mostly Friday, but okay, I'll keep my eye out. Karen from Colorado said that it's hard to find someone to work with adults, that she was at the Rights Law Conference today and no one was sure. And yeah, that's funny because I also had a friend that was in Loveland today, Karen, at that Rights Law workshop. But yeah, for sure, we want to be able to give you some resources there because I don't know if you want to speak, Carlyle, to what a difference that made when you got a diagnosis and how that was helpful for you.
I think a lot of the problem is that it's generally considered to be a childhood issue. And a lot of the criteria is based around children. And autistic adults and autistic children, although we have the same general problems, there's going to be a tremendous amount of differences between a child and an adult. And so a lot of them just don't want to work with adults because of that, and because you're not likely to keep coming back for any sort of support services because it's expensive and your insurance probably doesn't cover it. So those are the issues that kind of play into it. It's kind of sad when money runs the show.
Yeah, for sure. And Karen was also saying that she has a son with Down syndrome and autism, a second child with autism and ADHD, and we have my adult brother with autism. 4 people if my husband is diagnosed with autism in our home.
Sounds like a family I want to be a part of.
You'll have to make a visit over there to Colorado.
Yeah, I'm sure my wife will want to talk me into going back.
And that's another thing. I don't know if you know about, Karen, but I can give you the link. It's a national organization, but it started in Denver for people that were diagnosed both with Down syndrome and autism. So if you don't know of that Down syndrome autism connection group, I can also give you information about that. Because I think the more resources that we have and the more education we can bring to others, it's going to make us a richer community, right? And Kayla has a question. She said, would the autistic adult with a college degree need to be fully diagnosed? I know of a few adults that are pretty certain they are autistic, but do not have the funding or providers to be official.
You mean for like the panel that I was talking about?
Yeah, I'm not sure if she's talking about that or the Think College initiative. You know, and that just kind of depends on the situation. And right now, because we are just kind of in the beginning stages of bringing post-secondary education open to other students that are interested, the funding, there's still going to be the requirement of paying college tuition. There's usually an additional charge because the college or university will hire extra staff to be there for support and kind of that networking with professors and those kinds of things. And as the college and their program grows, then usually there also is a financial aid packet that you could apply for. So if that's what she was talking about, but I think for the panel that Carlyle was talking about, I don't see a reason why there has to be an official diagnosis before you could be part of that panel.
Yeah.
And I think that would be really helpful, Carlyle. It's kind of right now our task force every other month. We meet with a Zoom call, but this fall we're looking at having a face-to-face meeting. Right now, the universities that are most involved are the University of Idaho up in Moscow, Boise State University, and Idaho State in Pocatello. But Brigham Young is also looking at things. And so I think we're going to be kind of branching out. But, so maybe I could talk to you further, Carlyle, about, if there would be a time for our fall meeting that we could have a panel of autistic students or autistic graduates from college talk. I think that would be awesome.
Yeah, we can definitely.
Because, like so many task force and committees and things like that, it's the majority of the people are people that are not, do not have that disability. And so it's, these white privilege people trying to make decisions, and really the experts are most often missing at the table when we have committees and task force that study things. Yeah. So I don't know, Carlyle, if you at the BSU, if you get asked to serve on different committees, and if you feel like it's kind of a token, let's have an autistic person serve with us, or if you feel like the university, really appreciates the input from autistic adults.
I haven't actually been asked. Of course, I tend to stay quietly in my corner at work.
Right. So we are a little bit past the top of the hour, but I love the conversation that we're having, and I appreciate all the viewers. Know that the replay will stay up on this Visions and Voices Together Facebook page, and I can also post the direct link if you want to show that on a page. But Tiffany wants to get in here. Go Bengals. And we also have Jordy, who is saying hi to you, Carlyle. So I think it's beyond past time that we have the opportunity to learn and listen from autistic adults. And they are the true teachers and the true leaders. And I so appreciate you taking time from your evening, Carlyle, to be with us live tonight.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And it's not like I had anything else to do. My family's gone.
You didn't have a Jeep ride planned or anything for tonight, huh?
Oh, no. And my wife and daughter are doing her girls only birthday party. So I am totally alone for the evening.
Well, I so appreciate your time and also just the insights that you share with us. And like I said, you and the other autistic adults are the people that we need to be listening to and the people that we need to be learning from. So I so appreciate that. It makes a huge difference in my life and helps me with understanding and seeing another person's perspective, which is just something that always brings our community together. So I see you as a community changer and a great force in our community.
Well, thanks. It's been real fun talking with you.
Well, we will wrap up tonight's show. I want to tell our viewers that next Thursday, May 2nd, is going to be a Q&A time. And so we will be on at noon next Thursday, Mountain Time. But that's an opportunity for you and for myself as an education advocate to talk about any topic so I can answer specific questions that you have. And help make positive changes for your children. So until next week, I am Charmaine Tanner, the host of our Art of Advocacy show, and I look forward to getting to know more of you in person as much as possible. So thank you, and good night, everybody.